Safety Toolbox Talk Number 318. SOP for Toxic Gas and Vapor Exposure Prevention. 1. Purpose. To establish guidelines for the prevention, detection, and response to toxic gas and vapor exposures in the workplace, ensuring the safety and well-being of personnel and minimizing health risks. 2. Scope. This SOP applies to all employees, contractors, and visitors who work in or enter areas where toxic gases or vapors may be present, including laboratories, manufacturing areas, chemical storage areas, and any other location identified as a potential exposure risk. 3. Responsibilities. Management. Ensure the implementation, training, and periodic review of this SOP. Safety officers. Monitor adherence to safety protocols, conduct risk assessments, and coordinate emergency response. Employees. Follow safety guidelines, participate in training, report potential hazards, and use personal protective equipment, PPE, as required. Four. Hazard identification and risk assessment. 4.1 Identification of hazardous materials. Conduct a thorough hazard assessment to identify gases, vapors, or chemicals that could pose a risk. Review material safety data sheets, MSDS, for all chemicals in use to determine their toxicity, permissible exposure limits, PELs, and any special handling requirements. 4.2 Risk assessment. Assess the potential routes of exposure, inhalation, skin contact, ingestion, etc. Evaluate the likelihood of toxic exposure based on process conditions, storage methods, and emergency situations. Identify locations with the highest exposure potential and prioritize them for monitoring and control measures. 5. Engineering controls. 5.1 Ventilation systems. Install local exhaust ventilation, LEV, systems in areas where toxic gases or vapors are generated to capture contaminants at their source. Ensure adequate general ventilation to maintain air quality, particularly in enclosed spaces or areas with limited airflow. 5.2 Gas detection systems. Install fixed gas detectors to monitor toxic gases and vapors in real time. Use alarms that activate when concentrations exceed permissible exposure limits, PELs. Ensure detectors are calibrated and maintained regularly. 5.3 Containment and isolation. Use fume hoods, gas cabinets, and glove boxes to contain hazardous materials and reduce the risk of exposure. Isolate areas of high exposure risk by using barriers, control rooms, or restricted zones. Six. Emergency procedures. 6.1 First aid. Train employees in first aid procedures for exposure to toxic gases and vapors, including respiratory support, e.g. artificial respiration or CPR. Decontamination, removal of contaminated clothing and washing affected skin with soap and water. Eye flushing, using an eye wash station or emergency shower. 6.2 Emergency evacuation. Develop and implement emergency evacuation plans for areas with toxic gas exposure risks. Ensure workers know evacuation routes and assembly points. Install emergency alarms or sirens to alert workers of potential exposure. 6.3 Spill response. Provide procedures for responding to leaks or spills of toxic gases or vapors, including isolation of the affected area, Notification of emergency response teams or management. Proper disposal of contaminated materials and decontamination of affected areas. (6.4) Emergency equipment. Install emergency eye wash stations, safety showers, and first aid kits in areas where toxic gases and vapors are present. Maintain and inspect emergency response equipment regularly to ensure it is operational. 7. Documentation and record keeping. 7.1 Record maintenance. Maintain records of gas detection monitoring, training, inspections, and maintenance activities. Document any exposure incidents, investigations, and corrective actions taken. 7.2 Compliance. Ensure compliance with regulatory requirements e.g., OSHA, EPA, regarding toxic gas exposure limits, monitoring, and reporting. 8. Review and continuous improvement. 8.1 Periodic review. Review and update the SOP annually or after any major changes to operations, chemicals, or safety standards. Assess the effectiveness of control measures and revise them as necessary. 8.2 Employee feedback. Solicit feedback from employees on safety measures, incidents, and the SOP to identify areas for improvement. Act on feedback to enhance safety practices. This SOP aims to provide a structured approach to minimizing the risks associated with toxic gas and vapor exposure. Adhering to these guidelines will ensure a safer work environment, protect personnel health, and comply with regulatory standards. Thank you.